Hi guys, it's Mrs. Curry. Today we read chapters 17 and 18 of BFG. They're kind of short chapters, but they set up a really good point, getting ready for that big climax of the story that we talked about last time. So today we have three vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word is the word determined. Can you say the word determined? Great job. And determined means to make a firm decision and stick with it. So if I'm determined to get all of my work done tonight before 7 o'clock so I can watch TV, that means I'm going to get all of it done and I'm not going to budge. I'm going to make sure I get it all done. My next word is speechless. Can you say speechless? Great job. And speechless means to not be able to speak for a short amount of time. And lastly, our last word is swivel. Can you say the word swivel? Awesome. Swivel means to turn or turn around. Same thing. So go ahead and pause your video so that you can write down your BFG vocabulary words for today. Did you write them down? Great job. Today, you're in your BFG student packet and you're on page 33 and 34. Your quick write for page 33 was, have you ever met a famous person? What was it like? Tell me about it. And if you haven't met a famous person, what famous person might you want to meet, right? So think about that. And today in our BFG, we're going to be reading about the queen, right? The queen was the person that they were trying to, convince about the dragons last time they read. So the famous person that Sophie meets today is the queen, okay? And so we have two chapters today that we're going to read, and they're kind of short, but it's called Journey to London and the Palace. Okay, so we're really setting up our climax about what's about to happen in the story. Okay, Journey to London. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in the crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over. And this folding over bit made sort of a roof for her and gave her a wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on the skin that was so soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes. Here she is sitting in his ear. And each stride he took lifted him about 150 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his, when the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled, and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick, quick, over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those is the other giants all galloping back home after their guzzle," the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of the monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at their elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs were bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet were pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. "A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their bedsies tonight," the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill, but the grim encounter made her more than ever determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with lights of cars moving along. And there are the giants, galloping on their way back to Giant Country. Each time they came to a road, the BFG went over it and away, and no motorist could have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," said the BFG. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there was no lights in any of the windows. It was too early for anybody to be getting up. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," BFG said. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of things for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching me, even in the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said, "but you is the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in the streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lights in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on. But nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There's a strange magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide. That's the only word to describe what he was doing. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It was quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down the murky side street, but even if they had, they would have never believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered. "I's in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't. I is completely boggled. I is lost." "But why?" "Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in these green pasture fields." "Don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "That is where I take over." "Which way?" BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." BFG stopped. "You see that large roundabout ahead of us just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That's Hyde Park Corner." Even now, it was still an hour before dawn. There was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and a rider on the top of it. Can you see that?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I is seeing it," he said. "Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could clear jump over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch and over the horse and rider and land on the pavement on the other side?" "Easy," said the BFG. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "I promise," said the BFG. "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of the Hyde Park Corner." "Don't get flussed," the BFG said. "To me that is a snitchy little jump. There's not a thing-a-ling-a-ling to do about it." "Then go," Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railing that divided it from the park, he took off. There he is with Sophie in the middle of the park, and there he is running to try to clear the Hyde Park Circle or corner. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner, and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement on the other side. "Well done," Sophie whispered. "Now quick, over that wall." Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. "We're there," Sophie whispered excitedly. "We're in the Queen's back garden." Chapter 18, The Palace. "By gumdrops!" whispered the big friendly giant. "Is this really it?" "There's the palace," Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. "But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least." "Easily, I should think," Sophie whispered. "Then I is boggled," the BFG said. "How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping?" "Let's go a bit closer and have a look," Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward amongst the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting in began to swivel around. "Hey," Sophie said, "you're going to tip me out." "Shh," the BFG whispered back. "I is hearing something." He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through the gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed still as stone, and so did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. "You was telling me they had no soldiers in the back garden," the BFG whispered. "He wasn't a soldier," Sophie whispered. "He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful." "I's not too worried," the BFG said. "Those waxy big ears of me is picking up even the noise of a man breathing on the other side of the garden." "How much longer before it begins to get light?" Sophie said. "Very short," said the BFG. "We must go pell-mell for leather now." He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on the floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going around Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put in his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. "No," he whispered. "What are you listening for?" Sophie whispered back. "For breathing," the BFG whispered. "I's able to tell if a man human being or a lady by the breathing. He was a man in here, snortling a little bit too." He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black-cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. "No," he whispered. He moved on. "This room is empty." He listened in at several more windows, but each one he shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window at the very center of the palace, he listened but did not move on. "Ho, ho! We has a lady sleeping in here." Sophie felt a little quiver running down her spine. But who? The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room, and a cast of glimmer light onto the walls. It was a very large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at the face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspapers her whole life. For a few seconds she was speechless. "Is that her?" said the BFG. "Yes," Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow dreams into children's bedrooms. Some windows got stuck. Some windows were wobbly. Some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go, as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with a finger and a thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtain. "Now, don't you go tippin'-toppling backwards," the BFG said. "You must always be holding tight on with both hands to the inside of the window sill." Sophie did as she said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar out from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious stream into the wide end of the trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed was. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks, and poof! He blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very, very carefully, like a thermometer. "Is you all right sitting there?" he whispered. "Yes," Sophie said. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. "How long will the dream take to work?" Sophie whispered. "Sometimes it takes an hour, sometimes it's quicker, some is slow still, but it is sure to find her in the end." Sophie said nothing. "I's going off to wait in the garden," the BFG whispered. "When you is wantin' me, just call out my name, and I's comin' very quick." There's the BFG blowing into the Queen's window, and there's Sophie sitting right on the windowsill. "Will you hear me?" Sophie whispered. "You was forgetting these," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. And there she is, waiting on the windowsill for the Queen to get her dream. And that's the end of our chapter today. So, we are very close to the end of the story. Only 2 more sessions of reading. So, make sure that you're working on pages 33 and 34 and upload them to Seesaw or text them directly to me so that I can put them in our gradebook. See you all soon!